Untitled Chapter.
All see Black Lives Matter demonstrations.
Oppression is brought out.
So unfortunately, because I just feel like we're going down this road, we've been down this road before.
Things like we've had
Hello and welcome to Your Voice. I'm Ted Kofi. The label BAME or BME has its roots in the concept of political blackness which grew in the 70s. Anyone who was not white, it was argued, faced discrimination in the UK, so it made sense to unite people of non-white ethnicities together to fight for equality. But pushback started in the 90s when sociologist Professor Tariq Madood said this gave undue prominence to Caribbeans at the expense of Asian Britons. While initially met with a chorus of disapproval as being divisive of anti-racist voices, the opposition to the BAME label gradually grew as life experiences changed in the UK for different groups of minority ethnics. Now, we live in a Britain in which 2 of the 4 great offices of state are occupied by Asian Britons as Chancellor of the Exchequer and Home Secretary. The groundswell of protest following the killing of George Floyd in America by a police officer has given birth to an ever-expanding Black Lives Matter movement here and worldwide. Prominent Black Britons like David Lammy MP have called the label lazy and a bit of jargon, but he's also questioned what it should be replaced with. We ask that question today. Does the label BAME describe how you see yourself? Should it be graciously retired from public use? And if so, what should it be replaced with? Most importantly, this is your show, your voice, your shout. So please do get in touch and have your say via the number we'll be playing on the screen below. Here in the studio, however, to dissect this issue, first of all, are educational consultant Dalian Adofo and broadcaster Onyekachi Wambu. Gentlemen, a real pleasure to have you join us. Let's dive right in. Onye, didn't it make sense to put all the minority ethnic groups together in this kind of catch-all term? After all, the big problem back then was fighting racism, wasn't it?
Of course it made sense, which is why strategically people came together around the label. And again, it was a label that progressive forces, Black, adopted. The idea was that we'd come out of empire. We had suffered the same kinds of discrimination under empire. And when we were challenging empire, to have a label or a movement that enabled us to come together under one banner was really important.
Dalian, back then, I remember people of Asian background calling themselves Black. What do you think has happened since that time?
Well, I think what's happened is what always happens. Life changes, circumstances changes, and people's preferences, lifestyles, you know, what they become accustomed to change. So I think what has changed, and again, as you've correctly said with 2 British Asians, I actually find it interesting that it's an Asian who first put this, I guess, dissatisfaction with the term, because now we see it's 2 Asians who are in the highest offices with no, I guess, people of African descent in there. So that's what's changed. We live in a time when people want to take control of themselves, and the most important aspect of taking control, I guess, of yourself is how you identify yourself, because then that's how people react back to you.
Now, it's interesting, Anya, talking about how people identify themselves. These notions of identity are also woven around actual lived experiences. Is it true to say that as time has gone by, our lived experiences as people who are not white have diverged?
No, the strategy was an anti-racist strategy. The lived experiences in detail always different. I mean, the experience of a Ugandan Asian was probably going to be different from a black Ugandan. But, you know, we faced common challenges in the UK, and the strategy was, well, how do we unite to tackle those common challenges? The thing about naming, which a colleague here mentioned, is really important, because all of this happens within the context of empire. Yes. And part of what the empire does is, you know, Columbus unleashes this phenomenon in the empire. He goes west, looking for east in terms of India, right, and then names what he finds the West Indies. Yes, so instantly you have a way in terms of the empire being able to categorize. The exploration was about categorizing people, cataloging them, and then archiving them. And this is a source of power. The reason a lot of people...
Why is it a source of power?
Because it's about how you control, how you define and then you control. And the reason a lot of people were unhappy about the transition from black to BAME is that the latter seemed to be something that was kind of imposed, right? Whereas the latter was something that progressives in the anti-racist struggle came up with. The reasons it was imposed are ones that we can perhaps explore further.
Later on. Dalian, yeah. David Lammy recently said that it's a lazy,
yes,
jargonistic,
that's right,
definition of the catch-all group of minority ethnics in the United Kingdom.
That's right.
Is it lazy?
Absolutely, because what it does is it puts everyone, or it makes everyone look the same when they are not the same. It becomes an easier way to deal with people by removing the particular nuances within their experience that are also an important part of their identity. So by lumping everybody together in that manner, as Onya just said, for the person who is labeling others, because that is an act of power, to be able to label in the same way your parents can label the child, and it's not the child that names themselves, you impose what you feel they deserve onto them. So by actually giving that title, you disempower them. Yes, you definitely do.
Can I just say that we ran an Instagram poll and asked our viewers to see what they identified as, what they would like to call themselves. Many people just said black. One said of African descent. Another said that all of these labels erase our true identity and culture. So it begs the question, Onya, are these labels actually harmful to us? Doesn't everybody have to have a name or a tag by which we can collectively refer to them as?
Well, the labels are useful if you name yourself. I mean, when the black label was come up, when people developed that, it didn't eliminate the nuances, because what coming together to define blackness meant that you were defining a set of strategies or a set of principles that you wanted to fight around, which is quite different from the other side, when if you're then named by another side, those decisions haven't been arrived at by you.
They're not a matter of independent choice.
It's just a catch-all phrase. So what happened in the 70s was that, we looked at the struggles from the Asian progressives, African progressives. We had this black label. And this black label was something that the first time it's used politically is in Haiti. After the revolution in Haiti, Dessalines and the Constitution defines everybody who comes to Haiti as black to move forward. So whether you're white in Haiti or anything else, the term black became the all-encompassing term for Haitians, and it was a political term after what the Haitians have been through in liberating themselves from the French.
Daniel, let me ask you this,
sure,
and by all means comment in your own way as well. Very briefly though.
Sure.
You're talking about things which are historical. How much of this do you think that people who are under 25 and black and British, how much of this do you think they're aware of? It's certainly not taught in schools. Now, you're an educationist.
Yes, absolutely, Ted. And you've actually highlighted one of the key points I was going to go about, or speak about rather, because as you said, you know, the longer that we continue to live, there's always that risk of forgetting how and where things come from. So most people that might use the term black actually do not know that the black that they refer to them as a black person, being African, of a person of origin from Africa, is also a political label that others gel around and can use as and when they want. And going back to your question earlier about how harmful can it be, we can actually use the example of Black History Month. Yes, in the UK that we have in October, because Black History Month starts off in America by an African-American scholar by the name of Carter G. Woodson, who creates the African Negro Week as a way of bringing forth information that Africans have contributed to world history that gets whitewashed. And then it progressed into Black History Month.
We'll continue this point.
Yes.
For the moment, we're going to have to take a short break here. But please join us again for part 2, where we'll be continuing the conversation. See you in a few moments. Welcome back to Your Voice with me, Ted Kofi, and my guests, Dalian Odofo and Onye Kachi Wambu. Dalian, at the end of part one, you were just wrapping up some points about the fact that the word black isn't just a description of people's color,
Yes.
but it was actually a word with political significance. Can you just unpack that issue
Yes,
briefly?
absolutely. In the sense, and the point I was trying to get at was how the political definition of black as well causes more harm for those who can then be culturally black. And I was using the Black History Month example that was brought over from the United States, because this was the only month in which people of African descent could have their stories and contribution to history explored, because most of the curriculum is all whitewashed. And it was fine, it's kept the Black History Month, but then recently, about 2-3 years ago, you see a movement within the Asian community pushing for it to be changed to Cultural Diversity Month, because they couldn't see themselves in the word Black History Month. So now if you look at that now, what that will then eventually do is it will totally go back to erasing the African contributions, the original premise for which the month was set up for. Now Asians have all sorts, Diwali, Happy New Year celebrations, which they get to explore their culture. But why would we now have this contention within this month, which was set up specifically to allow African contributions to world history to be explored further?
That is profoundly significant. But Onye, when these names and labels are being applied, do you feel that it makes certain assumptions about the life conditions and experiences of people in the diaspora? Those who impose these labels make certain assumptions about the people they are labeling?
I think a lot of this is the government and others coming up with categories so that you can organize things quite easily.
Like chess pieces on a board?
Yeah, and whether those categories work is another question. You know, we started this, I said Columbus went out west, he arrives in the Caribbean, and he thinks he's in India, so he calls the people there Indians, and they become West Indians. And that was a way for him to organize what he found. And somebody, I think James.
However inappropriate.
However inappropriate.
Right.
But as James Baldwin used to say in a poem, Columbus was actually discovered by what he found. So the point is, it is possible to turn this around. And Columbus is famous because he discovered the Americas, not because, and the riches of the Americas, not because he was Columbus trying to organize his people.
Right.
And let's focus on the riches and the cultures in the Americas. Let's focus on the things that the Americas have given the world. Let's focus on the way that the Americas and the Atlantic have transformed the world. And then who played a role in that? Africans played a role in that. If you see the first people who arrive, and all the records of people who arrive in the Americas, in the churches, the African Methodist Church, in the slave records, they're called Africans. And then over the years, all these other names, black, Negro, some of them really offensive, yes? We've adopted all these other names. And you have the problems that you're describing because black is not a culture. Yes, African is a culture, black is a color. So if you wanted an African History Month, call it an African History Month, and call it a Black History Month, because it creates a problem. So if you want the specificity that you're talking about, call it around the people, and then we will deal with Asians who are in Africa, but it's part of African history. We will deal with whites who are in Africa, in Southern Africa, but it's part of African history. It's a part of a culture.
I see. Does this change the definer of a descriptor to a geographical location more than any other aspect of the particular people that we are trying to describe? So does the word African, should that be featuring in the name of how we define ourselves going forward?
Well, where using African becomes problematic, Ted, is you have to look at, for instance, we have in Libya now where you have Africans who are still enslaved. You would think we were back in the 16th century. Then we move further down south and we have people of Dutch and all other descents who were instituting apartheid. So African becomes very problematic. I think we've got to a stage where black is actually gaining more traction. Black as a culture, and I take Onye's point that black isn't a culture, but culture is made. Culture doesn't make itself. Yes, we have, if we take a place like Brazil, where they've always been against the label black, because once you label yourself black, you face the worst type of social conditions. But even over time now, we have Brazilians now wanting to identify culturally with the word black. So I take Onye's point, but again, culture is made. It's not an entity that's there by itself. And going back to your point about the political labeling, Ted, if you have the authority to label someone, then by default you have power over them. You set yourself as the standard, and everything that comes from you is substandard. So this is the power that we have to look at, how allowing labels that others give you become problematic.
But can I? No, please go ahead.
No, I
Please, go
understand the culture is made, but you have 400 years of experience, let's say, in the New World. So you've got the Africans, you've got the Negroes, you've got the Coloureds, you've got
People of colour.
People of colour.
Yes.
It's the same people.
Right.
What,
Yes.
What is this new soul that every generation we have to call the music something different
Yes,
to keep
okay.
it fresh? I mean, let's.
Yeah.
What about the continuity? I mean, these group are people of African descent who are there. You're right, they're creating a new culture, but it's an African culture in the West.
Absolutely true. No,
And
there's that too.
It has mixed with other cultures, and yes, we should discuss how complex it is,
Yes.
but we should then describe the African elements of that
Absolutely.
culture.
Can I just ask that why don't these conversations happen in the open, in the public, where it really matters? Why are these conversations being had kind of in specialist groups? Because I wouldn't read this in The Guardian. I wouldn't hear this at the BBC. We're doing this at Your Voice because it's who we are.
Yes.
Why don't these conversations take place more widely? Or is it the responsibility of people like you and you to go out there and talk about it more widely? Daniel?
I think the reason why it's not taking place so widely, again, boils down to power. Who has the power to allow you to speak? Yes, for me, at the very basic level, that's what it is. It's a bit like talking about race, because once you mention, it's synonymous with race, and race makes everyone uncomfortable, because we all, majority of us don't want to deal with what we know we're responsible for on the historical record.
Okay.
Yes.
This
that's
is,
my
I mean,
simple answer.
this could actually run on and on. But we've talked about the naming and so on. Let's talk about the experience. What do you think is unique about the experience of people of African origin that would make a label like BAME, frankly, inappropriate?
Well, I guess the A in BAME refers to African.
Yes.
So I guess...
No, Asian.
No,
Asian.
Asian.
Sorry,
yes.
you're right. Sorry. The
Yes.
black is the African element.
Yes.
Yes.
And mixed other. So what we are missing is that African journey. Yes, as you said, it's been constructed as black. Yeah. But it's richer than black. It's it's a global phenomenon, and I think we should have something that has the weight, to carry that. And that is a continent.
Okay, well, let me just throw a couple of stats at you here. Whatever we label this thing as, things are happening. The Windrush 2018 Home Affairs Select Committee acknowledged that 83 people were wrongfully deported. And officials feared there might be a further 81. That was at 2018. At least 11 of those deportees have subsequently died. The Windrush wasn't actually purely a Caribbean event, because 49 people were deported to Africa in 2017 and haven't been contacted by the Home Office, even after the Windrush scandal. There are other clearly I would say, horrific differences of experience. In childbirth, for example, did you know that black women in Britain are 5 times more likely to die as a result of complications in pregnancy than white women? And finally, of course, the COVID deaths, which we've all recently lived through. Per 100,000 of population, black Caribbeans were 78. Other blacks were 53. Indians were 35. Whites only 27 per 100,000 of population. The differences of experience are stark.
Of course.
What do you have to say about that, Anya?
Well, as I said, I mean, all of this is nuanced. There are differences of different life journeys. Some of that in terms of, you kept saying black, I mean, but the point about the black statistics are that, whether it's genetically, diseases that are passed on genetically, are a result of being of African origin. So why can't we just say people of African origin and then understand what has happened in terms of that journey of people of African origin?
Fine, and it's such a pity, Dalian. I wish we could have come back to this.
Not to worry.
But that's the end of part 2. Join us after the break when I'll be joined by Tosin Akintokun and Helen Femi Williams. And sadly, you have to leave us now. Dalian Odofo Onyekachiwambu, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you too for having us.
and producer and probation officer Tosin Akintokun.
Hello.
Ladies, thank you so much for joining me. We've had an interesting discussion so far, and I like to take it to another place now and think about what the social reality of Britain is. Is it really just about your colour? Is it really just about the difference, your difference of life in Britain? Is it really driven a lot by the colour that you are, Femi?
I don't know if I would necessarily say, you know, my identity is solely made up, or even the British identity is solely made up of colour. There are loads of different factors that play into that.
Such as?
Well, such as, I don't know, class. I think Britain is very much a class society.
But can I ask you, isn't class another construct for colour? Because there is no such thing, or is there, let me ask you, is there such a thing as an upper class black person?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you economically, if you have assets, if you have good housing, if you have a lot of disposable income, then you can call yourself I wouldn't necessarily call it an upper class black, but someone who is economically doing well for themselves. And I think that class plays a lot. I mean, I think race is a factor, but I don't think race is the only construct that we have, or race is the only social reality.
Let's butt up this concept of class and race. Do you know the black British market is worth £300 billion? That means that you and I and Femi and people who look like us are working very hard in this economy, and we're making a living, and yet we don't have very much political power. But those in the high class situation have all manner of privileges. So isn't race just a statement of where you are on the class pecking order?
I think there's a lot more to it. I think when we have the conversations, we definitely have to look deeper at so many other issues. You know, looking, for example, these socio-economic factors that affect the average black person out there. You know, also we're talking about the Black Lives Matter movement. Sadly, regarding the passing of George Floyd, that kind of started that massive movement, isn't it? Where we're now starting to say, actually, we need to start listening. We need to start to realize that a lot more needs to be done to make sure that we have equalities in either where you're talking in terms of business, whether you're talking in terms of employment, whether you're talking in terms of access to education, even. You know, we need to look at those issues and look at what else needs to be done in terms of making sure that there is some sort of equality, if you want to call it that, if that can ever be achieved.
Okay. Well, if we're talking then about equality, do you think the label BAME, Black, Asian and Minority Ethnic, provides the kind of equality and attention to the specificity of black experience that is required, Femi?
No, absolutely not. I think that there is a place for BAME, and I want to be really clear on that. I think a lot of the time, especially with Black Lives Matter and everything, everyone's just like, throw it in the bin, throw POC in the bin, throw BAME in the bin. And I would like to say that actually there is a place for it in certain aspects, but there's also not a place for it. So if I kind of like dissect what I just said, it's like,
Please do.
when I think of certain things, so for instance, the idea that there are no Black, Asian, ethnic minority people in a lot of financial services at sort of like a higher level, in like C-suite level, that to me is a BAME issue. When I think of poor housing...
May I just interject there? The most important financial officer in the United Kingdom is Asian. He's the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Yes, and that is true, but we need to not look at things being performative. Just putting a black person or an Asian person somewhere doesn't really make a difference just because they're there. So yeah, he's Asian, but so what? Like if we actually dissect the Asian community even, I can kind of go into that, but the point I'm basically making is some things are a BAME issue. So poor housing is a BAME issue because that affects all BAME people. However, if we look at certain things, like, so for instance, Britain's relationship with slavery, black people being stopped and searched at a higher rate than anyone else. If we look at higher education and these types of things, that are black issues. I think sometimes we're really lazy with our language and we make it easier for people to understand. So because we don't want, because we don't want to be like, oh, that's actually an African issue, or that's a Caribbean issue, or that's a South Asian issue, because you've just brought up Rishi Sunak, and even within the Asian community, it's not just all Asians are doing well; it's certain demographics and certain groups.
Okay, let me just pull up a few stats for you. These are realities that people who are called BAME don't face, but black people face. Okay, stop and search. There are 4 stop and searches for every 1,000 white people, compared with 38 for every 1,000 black people. That's staggering. Education. The percentage of pupils getting a strong pass, that's grade 5 or above, in English and Maths GCSE by ethnicity, black 38, white 42, Asian 50, Chinese off the charts at 75.
Interesting.
Now, if you look at the difference from the bottom and the top, that is the black and the Chinese, it's almost double the score. Now, these are the things that we know about. But what are the hidden experiences you believe that black people have that people don't know about, don't recognize, and don't acknowledge?
Maybe I would say one that comes to mind is our relationship with Britain. Black people have had a and Africans and Caribbeans, all of us have had a very strong relationship with Britain from kind of centuries and centuries. And I think sometimes that's whitewashed in how we look at the perception of black people in this country as though they just kind of arrived in the 60s or something. That being said as well, like, actually, yeah, that's kind of what I'm saying. I think the education is kind of lost on like actually where our relationship is with Mother Britain. Well,
if the education has been lost, it's what's good about it, but mostly what's bad about it has been completely whitewashed from history, hasn't it?
I think that actually raises a very important point, which kind of, I think the YouGov poll that recently suggested that a lot of people from the BAME community would actually love that a part of history should talk about the British colonialism, and that is something that is actually perhaps missing from when you're looking at the curriculum and you're looking at history lessons in schools. So I think it's important for us to have a more inclusive approach in terms of educating and raising awareness in terms of, I think the points that Femi raised quite well, that it didn't just happen that it just kind of appeared. We have been part of that history. But I think going back to your original question of the BAME experience. I think the issue for me is for it not to be a tick box exercise, which I think happens to be, from my perception and from my experience, seems to be the approach when you look at government statistics and you look at organizations and companies. It's kind of getting you to tick that box to identify yourself. But what are we actually doing to change the status quo? What are we doing to reduce the number of you mentioned the figures about stop and search. 25% of black Africans, BAME, are in custody. There's only about 14 to 16% overall in terms of population. That is quite a high amount. Now, from the stop and searches would obviously come the arrest, would obviously come potentially going through the court system. And when you even go through that process, there has been research to indicate that it's very, very, it's a biased system. That's
David Lamis reports.
Totally, that kind of brought that out.
Now Femi, the problem with these biases that we're talking about is that some of them are overt. Some of them we've got reports to actually prove, like stop and search. I mean, in the previous section, I talked about, you know, child mortality in childbirth was 5 times as great for black women as it was for white women. It is the hidden, unspoken, invisible, plausibly deniable experiences that black people have that I'm interested in. Could you highlight one or two? Go with you, Femi.
I think what you're talking about is like microaggressions and the kind of like passive aggressiveness that we find in this country. I think to some extent that's British culture. So a lot of the time when people talk about like racism in America being overt and racism here being covert, what they're really talking about is the way people say it without saying it.
Okay. Say it without saying it. That's brilliantly put. Can you just expand on that? We have just a minute.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with that. It's kind of underlying racial kind of tonation that comes across. So it's kind of saying, well, where are you from? But where are you really from?
Or that's aggressive.
That's aggressive, whereas I'm actually just asserting my position. I'm expressing myself. It might come across to you as strong, but that is not aggression. So that is kind of, you know, putting those into concepts and explaining what you're actually trying to project. But
so
yeah.
really, we're talking about the way people are labelled through the eyes of other people. We'll continue this conversation. That's the end of part 3. Join us after the break when we'll be wrapping up our discussion on the controversial BAME term, right here on Your Voice.
PlusNet want to celebrate Yorkshire Day, and there's so much to be proud of.
Welcome back. You're watching Your Voice with me, Ted Kofi, and my wonderful guests, Helen Femi Williams and Tosin Akintokun. Ladies, how should we arrive at a term for ourselves? Should we be naming ourselves? Should it be something that a government committee should be working on, and so on? Femi?
I don't think we don't need any more names. Like, we've had a lot of names given to us by people who are not Black or Asian or anything. We are, like, I'm Black, I'm British, I'm African, I'm Yoruba, I'm all these things in one person. And I think it's just time where we stop being so lazy in our language and appeasing other people by making it simpler for them and allowing them to just say BAME. No, where we can, we need to be just more nuanced in our conversation. So that's what I would say. Like, we don't need any term.
So, Tosin, we should have more agency and be more deterministic in the way we call ourselves.
No, I totally agree with what Femi has said. We haven't actually asked the whites how they would name themselves. So I think even that question, you know, I would call myself Black, and I want to call myself Black African of Nigerian descent. I don't need any government agency deciding what group to put me under. And I think I do agree with Femi's view as well, in terms of we've got all these names that we've had hasn't actually done any good. It's actually caused more issues when you look at what we've been talking about in terms of racial discrimination and bias and just having disparities across board. So, yep, I would rather just name myself as I would
name it and claim it.
Yeah, I would name it and claim it as opposed to somebody else doing it for me.
Fantastic. Well, I'm going to go to a brief poll. We spoke with our viewers on Instagram and asked who should name us. 100% we should name ourselves.
Yeah.
There was not a dissenting voice, and there we have it on the screen. The government or society should name us 0. We ourselves 100%. That's a slam dunk, as they call it, in that way. So if you now were to name yourselves, the big question is, what do you think it would be?
What
is your personal preference?
It changes for me. I'm like, I don't feel like I can just be like, call me this, because like sometimes I am all these things in one. And I don't think, like kind of like what Tosin said, but we don't ask white people to say, like, name yourselves, name your group, and all these types of things. We're not a species. Like, I'm Black and I'm British and I'm African and I'm Yoruba and I'm all these things in one person. I don't need to have a name for it.
Particularly Black people who have travelled all over the world, they have multiple identities which are expressed in different ways at different times. Tosin?
And I think that's where the confusion comes in about, okay, how would we name ourselves? They're people of mixed heritage. So how would that question then be answered by them? We have to think about that as well. And I totally echo what Femi has said in terms of, I would call myself Black African to start with. I'm of Nigerian descent and I am British. Please refer to me as that. I know what I don't want to be called. I don't want to be called coloured, which, you know, personally, I think I had an experience in the airport once when the lady said, oh, I'm going to search this coloured lady's bag. And I thought, I found that totally not appropriate.
But that used to be an okay term. So that's why I think it's problematic to come up with another term, because it will be okay in 2020, but it won't be okay in 2030. So I just think, just leave it all out. Exactly. Do you know what I mean? An old lady called me coloured and I had to be like, well, she's old. Do you know what I mean? That was fine in her day. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yes. But isn't it okay for the names to evolve as people's experiences evolve over time? So long as you take agency and drive the matter of how I can't come and call you Diana. Your name is Helen Femi, you know? I can't call you Angela. It's not your name. So you must name yourself, surely.
But that's what I'm saying. I've named myself as a Black British woman. I've named myself as a Nigerian woman. I've named myself as a European woman. Depending on where I am and what setting I am, I can choose any of those identities. And that's the great thing about being part of the diaspora.
Tosin, do you think the government and the authorities, including organisations like the BBC, who currently use the expression BAME. Do you think they're listening to conversations like this?
I think they are actually listening to conversations. I saw an article where I think Priti Patel said, don't call me BAME. So I read that article in the paper. So I think that there is now the rhetoric out there that the BAME, group has to, in terms of what the function it's serving now, is it actually doing more harm than good, and do they need to look at that and actually see whether they might be actually excluding a huge number of people from variety of ethnic backgrounds just by putting everyone under that umbrella. And that is a conversation I think needs to be had in terms of the powers that be.
Or you're creating more inequality. So like you kind of said, that the Chinese community does way better than any other group, including white British people. And I think when I read it, the Bangladeshi community does lower than anyone else. So by just giving money to BAME organizations, what you might be doing is just creating inequality between ethnic minorities in this country, because you're not being nuanced in your conversation of like who actually needs this money and how can we help them.
Well, what's coming across is how nuanced and how subtle and how complex something is, which is being simplified by these very kind of broad-brushed labels.
Absolutely. Because even Black Lives Matter is not a BAME issue, it's a black person's issue. Exactly. When black people went to work and tried to do their 9-to-5 job, the issue is one lady at work was saying, she had to have a conversation with her sons about what it means to be a black man all across the world. No other BAME person is doing that. So it's not an issue that we can just group under one person. It's specific.
Very good. Now, you're making your own conclusions. Do you think that it's time for us to retire the expression BAME? Femi?
No, because like I kind of said in the beginning, there are issues that are not just white British people don't go through. If you look at housing in this country, that is something where is a BAME issue.
But don't we then invite people, if we create that catch-all term, to view us all without the nuances that our individual experiences?
No, I think
require.
we just have to be nuanced in like what is an immigrant's experience, what is a second immigrant's experience, and these types of things, which of course is not going to be the experience of a white British person whose family has been here for 100 years. But just because you can use BAME in some issues, the point I'm more saying is let's be nuanced where we can. Where we can be, let's not even say black. Where we can be, let's say African. Where we can be, let's say Zimbabwe, if it's a Zimbabwe issue.
So you're talking about being as specific as possible?
Where necessary, yeah.
Well, here's a final poll that we did with our viewers on Instagram. We asked them how many people go for the word BAME and how many people feel it should be retired. 21% thought BAME was still okay, and 79% said no. So I think that's a resounding statement to say that maybe the expression BAME
it's not working.
It's
not working anymore.
And I totally agree with Femi. There is a time and place to use BAME if you are going to target resources, if you're going to make things better, and you think that perhaps using that category might help achieve that the means to that end. But there is a time and place for it where you need to be specific and refer to that individual as they would like to be addressed. Then that should be the way forward.
Great, Tosin. Can I ask you, Femi, and bring in any nuances that age groups may reflect on this. But in your experience as a young Nigerian, black, British woman, do you think our society is mature enough to have these conversations about identity without feeling triggered or worried?
I think there is no better time than right now to have these conversations. I think a lot of the time, maybe people are scared how they're going to come across. They're scared how they're going to come across to their white colleagues and stuff. But there's a level of education that comes to it, because if people don't know they're being problematic or they think it's okay, how exactly are they going to change? That being said, I don't think it's the onus of the minority to kind of free themselves from this oppression.
Let me pass this to you, Tosin. Which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Is it for the minority who feels the stone in their shoe over this matter of nomenclature, of being labelled and so on? Is it for them to speak up, or is it for those who have far greater authority to invite the conversation to come
I think those
forward?
with greater authority should invite the conversation, because the experiences, I think it's actually both ways. You can speak up for yourself, because there comes a time where enough is enough. I mean, George Floyd kept the famous phrase, "I can't breathe." And obviously, that then sparked the conversation we're having now. Even though there was a conversation of Black Lives Matter, but I think it wasn't as forefront as we have it these days. So I think it's both ways. I think you should speak up, because individuals have different experiences, and in terms of racial discrimination. And also the powers that be should also be inviting that conversation and finding ways to make things better.
Yeah.
Okay, so do Black people speak up enough? Very briefly.
I can't speak. I don't think. Do Black people speak up enough?
Your generation?
I think if you look at the protests, that shows that people are speaking up.
Tosin, over to you. Do you think Black people speak up enough about their reality?
Yeah, I think a lot of individual experiences don't actually, report it. They just leave it to, all right, I was called the N word, or told to go back to my country. They'll just ignore it and say, oh, I'm not going to bother to go to the police station. But I think when you find, large movements like, we had with the with the Black Lives Matter movement, yes, they do speak up.
But you can't expect.
Thank you very much. That's very sadly,
Thank you.
It's literally all we have time for.
Thank you.
Femi and Tosin, thank you so much. Well, it's all we have time for on this edition of Your Voice. I'd like to thank my guests in this part, Helen Femi Williams.
Thank you.
And Tosin Akintokun,
Thank you.
and of course to my earlier guests, Dalia Nadofo and Onyekachi Wambu. And thank you for watching. I'm Ted Kofi. Please join us again next time here on Your Voice. It seems extraordinary that there's nothing that the coronavirus doesn't touch.
All see Black Lives Matter demonstrations.
Oppression is brought out.
So unfortunately, because I just feel like we're going down this road, we've been down this road before.
We've had